The night of the Ashwick Winter Assembly was the coldest in 3 years, and Thomasina Hartley stood at the edge of the room in a gown she had turned herself, the pale green silk reversed so that the faded seam fell at the back where no one was meant to look. The candles in the long gallery ran to 60, and their light caught every jewel in the room, except the ones she did not have. Around her, the assembled company of the county pressed and glittered and turned, and she was nowhere in their field of vision. She had trained herself, across a season of such evenings, to exist in precisely this way, present enough to discharge her duties to Lady Dorothea, invisible enough to cause no inconvenience. She held a cup of negus she did not intend to drink, and watched the door. She was watching it because Mr. Finch had sent word that afternoon. The note had reached her through Mrs. Anstey's hands rather than through the household post, and it had said only that he would come and that she should not leave. She did not yet know what he was carrying. What she did not yet know was that by the time that assembly ended, the words her stepmother had spent 6 months carefully arranging would be taken apart in front of the same company that had heard them spoken. She did not know it. She kept her eyes on the door, and she waited. 3 weeks before her father died, he had taken her hand in the library at Hartley House and told her that she would be provided for. She had believed him, because he had never given her cause not to. He was a methodical man, a solicitor's son who had married well and managed his affairs with the kind of care that leaves no clause unwritten. He had pressed her hand and told her that the details were in Mr. Finch's keeping and that she should trust the document over any private assurance. He died on a Thursday in November, and by the following Saturday, Lady Dorothea had dispatched Thea to her cousin's house in Bath. The stated reason was propriety. A household in mourning required a period of ordered quiet, and Lady Dorothea was the presiding authority of that household now, and she had decided that Thea's presence was not consistent with the order she intended. The cousin, a Mrs. Price, was perfectly civil and perfectly uninterested, and Thea spent 6 weeks in a small room on the upper floor of a house in Brock Street, reading what she could find and waiting for a letter that did not come. The reading of the will was held without her. She learned this not from Lady Dorothea, but from the housemaid, who mentioned it in passing while bringing coal. The way one mentions a meal already eaten, rather than a thing that might have mattered. The letter Mr. Finch had directed to her at Mrs. Price's address never arrived. She wrote to him twice and received no reply. And she told herself there had been some confusion of addresses, that the absence meant nothing, that her father had provided for her in the terms of the document, and that the document existed independent of anyone's willingness to discuss it. She told herself this because the alternative was a silence she had no means to fill. In January, Lady Dorothea wrote to say that the season was opening and that Thea was to return to London. The phrasing of the letter was gracious in the way that foreclosure notices are gracious, perfectly cordial, entirely closed. Thea was to serve as her stepmother's companion during the social engagements of the coming months. She was to be useful. Her allowance, which had already been reduced once, would continue at the new rate. She was given 3 days to make herself ready. She packed what she had. She took the post to London. The season opened with Lady Norwood's ball, which was held in a house in Grosvenor Square, with enough footmen on the staircase to outnumber the guests. Thea arrived in the gray silk she had worn the previous season, retrimmed with a narrow edge of cream ribbon that Lady Dorothea had declared presentable, by which she meant invisible. They entered together, and within 30 seconds of entering, Lady Dorothea had located 3 acquaintances and turned to introduce Thea as my stepdaughter, who is here to assist. The phrase fell on the assembled conversation like a stone laid over a garden path. No one crushed by it. No one disturbed. It simply became the surface underfoot, and everyone walked on. Thea noted it, filed it alongside the 6 weeks in Bath and the unanswered letters, and looked across the room. Edmund Vane, Earl of Ashwick, stood at the far end of the gallery, with his back to the fireplace and his arms at his sides, which was how he stood in every room he entered, as though the room had been arranged for his convenience, and he was permitting it to exist. He was 34 years old, and his face had the quality of a landscape in winter, accurate and cold, and briefly illuminated when the light shifted. He was not speaking to anyone. He was watching the room with an attention that never quite settled. She had heard of him before she saw him. Everyone in Lady Dorothea's circle spoke of the Earl of Ashwick in the particular tone used for men who had not yet remarried, a tone combining appetite and frustration in roughly equal measure. His countess had died some years earlier, and he had withdrawn to the country for 2 seasons before returning to London, and now he was here, and his presence at any event was treated by the hostess as a species of victory. He was watching the room. At some point his gaze passed over her. She could not have said, afterward, whether it paused. He gave nothing away. His face was the same carved whether it had been 2 seconds before, and he looked elsewhere. And she looked elsewhere, and the orchestra began. She did not think about it again, or she tried not to. Lady Dorothea's visit to Ashwick Court came 3 weeks into the season, under the guise of returning a library volume the late Countess had lent years before. She brought Thea along, as she brought Thea everywhere, and the house received them in the formal drawing room with the cordiality of a house that has been kept in good order and wishes it to be noted. Ashwick was correct and brief. He sat across from Lady Dorothea and her particular companion, Miss Cecily Norwood, who had been attached to their party since the 2nd week of the season, like a jewel newly set, and he answered their questions with the economy of a man who has learned to give responses rather than conversation. Miss Norwood was 22 years old and had the confident blondness of a woman whose reflection has never once surprised her. She laughed at precisely the right moments. She held her teacup with the assurance of someone born knowing the correct grip. Lady Dorothea watched the two of them across the tea table with a satisfaction she did not quite conceal. Thea sat to one side and poured when she was required to pour, and said nothing that was not asked of her. The visit lasted an hour and a quarter, and on the way home in the carriage, Lady Dorothea described the Earl as a sensible choice for any woman of sufficient family, by which she meant a woman with more family than Thea currently appeared to possess. Thea said she was glad the afternoon had been pleasant. It was Mrs. Anstey who changed the register of things at Ashwick Court. She was 63 years old and had been the housekeeper at Ashwick since the previous Earl's time, and she had a face that recorded everything it had witnessed without editorial commentary. She had fallen ill in the 1st week of February with a chest complaint that kept her to the servants' wing for 4 days, and during one of Thea's subsequent visits to the house with Lady Dorothea's party, Thea had gone looking for a warm shawl left in the 2nd-floor corridor and taken a wrong turn. She had found herself outside the housekeeper's room at the end of the back passage, and through the door she had heard a sound that stopped her. A woman trying to suppress a cough and failing. She knocked. Mrs. Anstey opened the door in her dressing gown with the look of a person who has been caught in an undignified posture by someone whose opinion she does not wish to form. She began to say that she was perfectly well, and that the young lady need not concern herself. Thea came in anyway. There was a small fire in the grate, and a volume of sermons on the table that did not look as though it had been opened. Thea sat down in the chair beside the bed and asked whether Mrs. Anstey would prefer something read that was not sermons. Mrs. Anstey said she had nothing else at hand. Thea went to the 2nd-floor library and came back with a volume of essays she had found by a natural philosopher whose name she had never heard, but whose prose was careful and particular and interested in small, observable things. She read for 40 minutes. Mrs. Anstey said nothing until the chapter was finished, and then said that the writing was better than she had expected, and that Thea had a pleasant reading voice. Thea did not know that he was in the doorway. She did not know it until she had read the second chapter, and looked up to find Mrs. Anstey's gaze directed past her right shoulder at someone standing in the passage. She turned. Ashwick stood with one hand on the doorframe, and the expression he always wore, which gave nothing, which told her nothing, which she filed alongside everything else she had not been meant to see. He said only that he had come to ask after Mrs. Anstey's health, which was precisely the kind of sentence that carries more than its stated weight when delivered by a man who has not, in 6 weeks of proximity, said anything to Thea Hartley that was not strictly required. Mrs. Anstey said she was improved. Ashwick said he was glad to hear it. His eyes moved to Thea once, briefly, and then he withdrew. Thea closed the book. She noted that her pulse was audible somewhere at the base of her throat. She decided this was the result of having been surprised. She told herself it was not important. The first time she understood that it might be important was 3 days later, when he crossed a drawing room to ask her opinion of the essay she had been reading, which she had not mentioned to anyone. He had either seen the cover in the housekeeper's room, or he had gone to find the book afterward, and either way, he had paid attention to something she had not expected him to see. She answered carefully, because she had learned that careful answers kept the conversation brief, and brief conversations kept the expectations manageable. He listened with the focused stillness of someone taking inventory. When she finished, he asked one further question, which was whether the natural philosopher had addressed the subject of tidal patterns, because he had a standing dispute with his land agent on the matter. She said he had not. Ashwick said that was a disappointment. Something in the region of his mouth shifted, not quite far enough to constitute a change of expression, and he walked back across the room. She stood with the cup she had been holding and thought about a man who disputed tidal patterns with his land agent. If you find yourself drawn into Thea's story, do stay near. There is more yet to see. The wound that Edmund Vane carried was not visible from the drawing-room side. One learned it, as one learned most things about him, by indirection and accumulation. His wife Charlotte had died in the winter of William's birth. The birth had been a long and difficult one, and the physician had been called twice before the final hour, and Charlotte had known at some point in that last hour what was happening, and she had made the nurse bring the infant to her before it was over. Edmund had been outside the door. They had not let him in until it was too late, and he had spent the subsequent years building, with the same quiet discipline he brought to everything else, a life in which that particular door would never be encountered again. William was 6 years old and lived at Ashwick under the care of a nurse and a governess, and Edmund visited regularly and maintained every external arrangement required by the role of a conscientious father. What he had withheld was the kind of presence that requires one to be broken open by another person's neediness. He had decided, without quite naming the decision to himself, that his son would be safer from the cost of that closeness than he would be from its absence. He had been wrong about this. He was beginning to suspect he had been wrong about this. He had begun to suspect it on a February afternoon when he had stood in a doorway and watched a woman read aloud to his housekeeper from a book on natural philosophy, and noticed that his son's nurse had come to stand in the same passage to listen, and that the nurse was smiling in the specific way people smile when something restores a thing they had forgotten they were missing. He had gone back to find the book afterward. He had not, at that point, begun to question his own arrangements. The questioning was slow and came later, in increments, the way a river changes course over successive winters, rather than in a single dramatic flood. Miss Norwood was present at nearly every engagement of the February season, She was present with the particular consistency of a woman whose attendance has been organized by someone other than herself, and Thea understood perfectly who had organized it, and to what end. She did not resent Miss Norwood. She found her, on the contrary, rather admirable. A woman who had been given a script and was executing it with precision and good humor, which was not a small accomplishment. What she did resent, without permitting herself to name it as resentment, was the second time Lady Dorothea introduced her in public. It was at a dinner at Lord and Lady Whitmore's house in the 3rd week of February, a company of 24, and Lady Dorothea had sat across the table to a Mrs. Fenton, who had asked after Thea's connection to the household. "She is my stepdaughter, and very useful to me. We keep her busy." The word "keep" arrived in the sentence like a hairpin through silk. Nothing showed on the surface, and underneath, something had been secured. Mrs. Fenton had smiled with the accommodating vagueness of a woman who understands a social taxonomy, even when its cruelty is dressed in civility. And the table had moved on, and Thea had looked at her wine glass and decided that the glass was interesting. Ashwick was seated 2 places to her left. She did not look at him. She told herself she had not noticed whether he had heard. The third voicing came not from Lady Dorothea, but from the woman herself, though at Lady Dorothea's direction. This was Thea's understanding of it, at least. Miss Norwood was not unkind by nature. She was, however, entirely fluent in the language of the season, and when she said to the small gathered group near the Whitmore music room that the Ashwick entertainments were certain to be all the more pleasant this year for the Earl's returned spirits, and added in an aside meant to be heard, "Though of course Miss Hartley will be there to manage the arrangements, as she manages so many things for Lady Dorothea." The word manage carried the same structural weight as keep. It placed Thea in the room as a function, rather than a person. It was accurate to Lady Dorothea's intentions without being an outright lie, and that made it harder to answer than a lie would have been. Thea said nothing. She noted the flush at her left wrist, where the glove met the hem of her sleeve, and pressed the back of her hand briefly against the cool window frame, and let it pass. The dark moment arrived on a Thursday in the 3rd week of March, at a private dinner at Ashwick Court. Lady Dorothea produced the letter over the fish course. It was a single sheet, directed in a hand that Thea could not immediately identify, though the phrasing was arranged in the rhythm of her own sentences, and the signature was her own name. It said, in substance, that Thea was aware of the terms of her father's will, specifically the conditional income of £400 annually, and the interest in Ashwick Court tied to a suitable marriage within the season, and that she had chosen not to disclose these terms to the Ashwick household, lest knowledge of them compromise her position as a dependent relation. Lady Dorothea read it aloud with the measured deliberateness of a woman who has rehearsed the reading. The table was 8 people. Ashwick sat at the head. Miss Norwood sat at his right. Thea sat near the foot with a glass of wine she had not touched and a plate she could not see the point of. Lady Dorothea said, once the letter was read, that she had felt it her duty to share this information with the Earl of Ashwick, given his connection to the property referenced, and that she had of course been deeply pained by the discovery. Thea said, in a voice she kept at an even register, only by concentrating on the grain of the table, "I have never written that letter." Lady Dorothea said that handwriting was a difficult thing to dispute, and that she had, of course, drawn her own painful conclusions. Ashwick's face gave nothing. It had the quality it always had, the carved winter stillness, and she could not read him, and she did not try. She looked at the letter in Lady Dorothea's hand, and she felt the floor of the moment drop, the way a bridge drops when the pins holding it have been removed one by one over a long period, and only now, with the weight of this specific crossing, gives way completely. She knew who had intercepted Mr. Finch's letters. She had known for some time, in the way one knows a thing one has not been willing to name. She had not known until this moment that the letters had been kept, adapted, and turned into a weapon pointed in the other direction. She said, a second time, and still at the same register, "I have never written that letter. Mr. Finch will confirm it." Lady Dorothea said that Mr. Finch had been directed no correspondence by her, and that she could not speak to what Mr. Finch might or might not confirm. The dinner continued. Thea did not eat. She held herself very still in her chair and thought about the note Mrs. Anstey had passed to her that afternoon, and the words 2 days by post-chaise. And she held on to that specific piece of information the way one holds a coin in a closed fist when everything else has been taken. The Ashwick Winter Assembly was held the following Friday in the long gallery of the court, which accommodated a company of 40, with room for the orchestra at the far end and the card tables in the adjoining room. It was the last significant gathering of the county season, and Lady Dorothea had dressed with the finality of a woman closing accounts. A gown of deep aubergine silk, her best pearls, Miss Norwood positioned at her side like a note of endorsement. Thea wore the turned green silk. She held her cup of negus. She watched the door. At 8:30, Mr. Gerald Finch came through it. He was 51 years old, thin in the manner of a man who forgets to eat when he is occupied, and he carried a leather document case worn soft at the corners with years of use. He had come from Bath by post-chaise in 2 days, arriving that afternoon at the Ashwick Village Inn, and he had sent word ahead through Mrs. Anstey because he had learned, by the time he left Bath, precisely whose hands the household post passed through. He had the intercepted letter with him. He had obtained it from the postal clerk in Bath, a Mr. Hyes, who had accepted a payment from Lady Dorothea's man of business some months earlier, and had been persuaded, by the weight of his own conscience, and by Mr. Finch's particular quality of patient professional persistence, to produce the original. Thea saw him cross the gallery toward her, and felt something she had not felt since her father's library. The specific physical sensation of a door opening rather than closing. She met him at the edge of the orchestra's line of sound, where conversation was possible, and he drew her to the side, and he placed in her hands, first, the original letter he had directed to her at Mrs. Price's house in Bath. It was 6 months old. The seal had been broken and repressed, imperfectly, the wax carrying the slight cloudiness of a second heat. Her name was on the outside in his careful clerk's hand. She held it and felt the edges of the paper, the real edges of a real document, and kept her face still. Mr. Finch said, quietly, that the letter contained the terms of her father's will. £400 annually from the consolidated estate income, and a conditional interest in Ashwick Court representing 1/3 of the original mortgage partnership her father had held at the time of the property's refinancing, said interest to vest upon her marriage to a suitable party within the current season. He said that the letter had not been delivered because it had been intercepted by an agent of Lady Dorothea's household, and that the postal clerk who had accepted the payment was prepared to provide a signed statement to that effect. He then said, his voice carrying the precise neutrality of a man who is stating a professional judgment rather than rendering a personal verdict, that a forged document purporting to be Thea's communication of these terms to the Ashwick household had recently come to his attention, and that the original letter in her hands, compared against the forgery, made the matter unambiguous. A letter produced in Bath 6 months ago and intercepted before delivery could not have been written by a person who, at that time, did not yet know its contents. Thea said she was grateful to him. He said it was his professional obligation, and then paused, and added that he was also very glad. He had, she understood, looked for her for 6 months. She stood holding the letter and looked across the room. Lady Dorothea was seated near the window with Miss Norwood and 2 county acquaintances, her expression holding the calibrated confidence of a woman whose arrangement of the world has been ratified by every event to date. She had not yet seen Mr. Finch. Ashwick was at the room's far end near the fireplace. He was watching her. Not the room. Not the assembly. He was watching her, specifically. With the focused stillness she had catalogued across weeks of evenings and had not allowed herself to interpret correctly. His gaze did not move when she looked at him. He had been waiting for her to look. She had a second of cold clarity in which she understood, with the particular precision of someone who has been trained to expect nothing, that he had not spent 6 weeks paying careful attention to her because she was a useful fixture of his acquaintance's household. She did not let herself name what this meant. Not yet. The floor of that particular room had dropped once already this week, and she was not ready to test another. Mr. Finch said he would need to speak to the Earl directly, and soon. She said she thought that could be arranged. What happened next she would reconstruct afterward from the parts she had managed to observe, because she was not certain, in the moment of it, that she was observing it clearly. Ashwick crossed the floor of the long gallery in 3 deliberate strides and stopped in front of Lady Dorothea's seated group. The company around Lady Dorothea became very still in the way that companies become still when a room has shifted register and no one yet knows the new terms. Miss Norwood's cup paused at a measured height. The 2 county acquaintances leaned back, a fraction each. Lady Dorothea looked up with the settled authority of a woman who has never been approached this way by a man of this rank, and found it anything other than a compliment. Ashwick said, at a volume the assembled company of the room could hear without straining. Lady Dorothea, Mr. Finch, who is your late husband's solicitor, has arrived this evening. He carries correspondence intended for Miss Thomasina Hartley that was directed to her 6 months ago and did not reach her. He will require a brief conversation. Lady Dorothea's expression contracted around a single point, as a document contracts when the flame touches its corner. She said, with a composure that cost her something visible, I cannot imagine what correspondence the solicitor might have that was not properly managed. Ashwick said, I expect he will explain that when he speaks. He turned from her then, which was itself a statement in the grammar of that room. He walked to where Thea stood beside Mr. Finch at the edge of the orchestra's reach, and he stood in front of her, and the particular quality of his attention, which she had spent 6 weeks filing as ambiguous and inconclusive, and probably not what it appeared to be, resolved in his face into something she no longer had the vocabulary to misread. He said, Thomasina. Not Miss Hartley. Not a title applied to a function. Her given name, in the hearing of 40 people, which in the grammar of this room and this season was not an informality. It was a declaration of the person to whom it was directed. She held the letter and kept her face still and said, Your Grace. He said quietly, in a register the 40 people could barely hear, but would, she understood, hear perfectly. I should have asked the right questions sooner. I am asking them now. Will you permit me to do that? She thought about 6 months in a small room in Bath. She thought about the word keep, and the word manage, and the word assist, and the way they had been laid down one on top of another across a season until they formed a floor she had been expected to live on. She thought about a book on natural philosophy, and a question about tidal patterns, and a man who stood in doorways. She said yes. A single word. It was enough. Mr. Finch had moved during this exchange to a position near the room's center where Lady Dorothea's seated group remained, and he produced from the leather case the original letter, its broken seal visible, and the postal clerk's signed statement, and he laid them with the particular care of a professional man placing evidence before those who require it. Lady Dorothea looked at the seal, and something that had lived in her expression for the entire season, the settled confidence of a plan that has encountered no obstacles, departed it. What remained was smaller and more honest, and in its honesty, briefly, almost pitiable. She did not speak. Miss Norwood looked across the room to where Thea stood beside Ashwick, and her expression held, for a single clause, the recognition of a woman who has understood the field clearly and knows which way the result has gone. She was not cruel. She inclined her head slightly, almost imperceptibly, in a gesture that might have been acknowledgement, and she looked away. She was, Thea had always thought, a person operating a script she had been handed rather than one she had written, and the night's evidence had simply rewritten it. Mrs. Anstey appeared at the gallery's side door at some point after 11, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl over her housekeeper's black, on the grounds that she had heard there was an assembly, and she had an interest in how it concluded. She stood near the door and watched with the expression of a woman whose patience has been vindicated across a long period, and when she caught Thea's eye from across the room, she made no declaration, and needed none. The county, of course, talked. It was what a county did, and Thea had lived long enough inside its mechanisms to understand that this, too, was a form of documentation. By the following morning, the assembly's particulars had been distributed through 3 households, and by the afternoon the essential shape of it, the solicitor with the intercepted letter, the forged document, the Earl's 3 strides across the floor and the use of a given name, had taken on the quality of a story the county would repeat in drawing rooms for years. The procedural confirmation was completed within a fortnight. Mr. Finch oversaw the execution of the will's terms in their original form. The £400 was confirmed, and the conditional interest in Ashwick Court was noted in the formal record. The conditional clause specified a suitable marriage within the season. The season had not yet closed. Ashwick made his application in the library where Thea had first looked at the shelves and thought that this was a room built by someone who read for the love of it rather than the appearance. He said what he meant, which was his habit, without preamble and without qualification. He said that he had been watching her since January, and that he had taken some time to arrive at honesty about what that watching signified, and that he would prefer to be honest with her than otherwise, because she had given him no indication that she wished to be managed. He said that the conditional clause in her father's will had played no part in his thinking, and that he hoped she understood the distinction, and that if she did not yet trust that distinction, he would wait. She said she thought she had spent enough of her life waiting. The smile that arrived on his face then was brief and unguarded, and entirely different from the expression that faced the room in ordinary company. She filed it alongside the question about tidal patterns and the doorway in the servants' passage, and understood that she had been accumulating, without intending to, an inventory of the real person behind the winter landscape, and that the inventory was rather fine. She said she would have him. He said good. With the solemnity of a man for whom good covers an expanse he does not presently have the words to cross. The wedding was a quiet one by the season's standards, held in the parish church 2 miles from Ashwick Court in the first week of April, with Mr. Finch and Mrs. Anstey among the witnesses and the county represented by a respectful handful of neighbors whose goodwill, Thea thought, had always been present in the room and simply waited for the occasion to be named. Lady Dorothea was not present. She had removed herself to her sister's house in the north, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understands when an arrangement has concluded. And if there was grief in that removal, it was the private kind. The grief of someone who finds that a plan she believed was well made was actually built on ground she had mistaken for solid. Thea did not pursue the grief or the woman who carried it. She had no appetite for that kind of accounting. What she had appetite for was the drive back to Ashwick Court on a Thursday afternoon in early April, with the year turning into itself outside the carriage windows, and the house appearing at the end of the avenue with its stone frontage and its east-facing library windows and its long lawn still carrying a residue of frost. There is a particular quality of arrival that is different from every other kind of arrival, and she felt it when the carriage door was handed open and she stepped onto the gravel and looked at the house and understood that it was hers to walk into. William was brought downstairs that evening. This was at Thea's request, and Mrs. Anstey had facilitated it with the capable discretion of a woman who has been waiting for this particular request for some time. He was 6 years old, with his father's gray eyes and a set of his mouth that was entirely his own, and he came down the stairs in his nightclothes, holding the banister in a two-handed grip, looking at her with the guarded assessment of a child who has been cared for at a correct and careful distance and is not entirely certain what an unlicensed proximity represents. Thea sat down on the lower stairs so that her face was level with his, which was a thing she had done instinctively with the housemaid's younger children in Bath and had apparently not forgotten. She said that she had heard he was interested in the horses. He said that he was, particularly the gray one. She said she was also particularly interested in the gray one, and that she thought they would have a great deal to discuss. He looked at her for a moment, with his father's quality of stillness, the measuring kind, the kind that was not coldness but care-wearing caution's face. Then he came the remaining 2 steps down the stairs and sat beside her. And she did not reach for him, and he did not reach for her. And they sat side by side on the Ashwick staircase, with the evening quiet around them, and the sound of a fire in the drawing-room reaching them in the form of warmth rather than sound. Edmund stood at the bottom of the stairs and watched them. Whatever he carried in the space where Charlotte's last hour lived, it did not leave him that night, and she did not expect it to. What she saw instead was the change that the watching made in his face. A slow resolution of weather, the way a sky looks when it has finished deciding. He had believed, for 6 years, that closeness cost more than it was worth. He was revising this. She could see the revision in his face, the specific difficulty of it, and she did not look away. Mrs. Anstey appeared at the drawing-room door with the expression of a woman fulfilling a professional obligation and took William back upstairs, and the boy went without complaint, which Mrs. Anstey noted to herself as significant. Thea rose from the step. Edmund put out his hand, and she took it, and he held it for a moment with the careful gravity of someone handling a thing he intends to keep. And then he drew her toward the drawing-room door, where the fire was burning and the windows faced north and west. Snow had come while they were on the stairs. It was falling now outside the long windows, fine and unhurried, covering the frost-pale lawns and the avenue of bare elms and the stone ledge where a candle still burned from earlier in the evening, its flame undisturbed. Thea stood at the window and watched the snow come down over the ground that was also hers, by 1/3 interest and by every other measure she now possessed, and let herself feel, without qualification, the particular gravity of being exactly where she was, not maintained, not managed, not useful to someone else's arrangement of the world. She had been sent away before the reading. The solicitor had come to find her. And this, at the end of all of it, was where she stood. If Thea's long road to this window moved you, leave a word in the comments. Every story here is written for those who understand that quiet dignity is its own kind of waiting, and that some rooms are worth coming home to.